Do you ever spend a bit too long reading forum posts and all of a sudden you've made a comprehensive design document for a video game you might never be able to make in your entire life? In our free time away from making videos, we here at the Ineffective Collective like to indulge in some social media browsing of our favourite games' fan bases. This is a terrible recreational activity that I cannot recommend, but I'm too deep into it to forget it anymore. I have been forever scarred by Fire Emblem fans' eternal wars of was Fates a bad game and did Edelgard do anything wrong? Amidst this raging storm, however, there is one sentiment I keep encountering oddly frequently for how specific it sounds. There should be a Fire Emblem fighting game. At first, this idea baffled me. Turning Fire Emblem into a fighting game? Don't we have enough of that in Smash Bros? Even if we were to make a dedicated game, aren't there any more fitting IPs or genres to use instead? Is there that much overlap between fans of the two? On second thought, probably not. I was looking predominantly in dedicated Fire Emblem fan spaces, and I did see a lot of naysayers too. No matter how hard I tried though, I couldn't get this idea out of my head. Could I theoretically translate Fire Emblem into a fighting game? There are lots of contrasting design philosophies between the two that would take some far outside the box thinking to fuse together. Sure, the Fire Emblem characters do fight. Okay, that does put it a step above several other IPs. I mean, look at the way this battle is framed. Does that not look like a fighting game to you? Most of the fans I see suggesting this idea simply want to beat people up as their favourite characters and admire the fancy animations. That's fair on them, I suppose. As someone who likes Fire Emblem and likes fighting games, I assume the responsibility of doing all that brainstorming for them. Let's pretend that Nintendo and Intelligent Systems have given a random ideas guy like me a multi-million-pound budget, a hyperbolic time chamber, and an order to develop a fully fledged Fire Emblem fighting game spin-off in time for the next Nintendo console's launch. Logically, the first question we should ask is, how would the game play? Turns out my logic here is questionable because of all the fans who've already discussed this concept, hardly any of them have tackled this question. 9 times out of 10, they'll skip straight to asking who would be on the roster. But this is the overall direction of the game. This will help us decide who to add to the roster and how they should play. Without this context, any roster you can provide is nothing more than a list of characters. I do see a possible reason why they avoid this question, because it's hard. When you think about it, fighting games and strategy RPGs like Fire Emblem have completely different, almost polar opposite gameplay. Fighting games are high-pressure environments where you're tested on your adaptability to human opponents. Your knowledge of the other character's tools, your observation of how the opponent uses them, your reflexes against them, your knowledge of your own character's tools and how they interact with the other character as well as how the opponent plays them, all under a time limit and the threat of exploding if you get hit once with the right move. Fighting games have some of the most complex gameplay of any genre, and with that comes a daunting learning curve that can be hard to sell newcomers on. Meanwhile, in Fire Emblem, enemies only have a few basic attack types, of which the damage numbers are low enough for most people to calculate. Enemies are also controlled by an AI that is predictable and manipulatable into always taking the same actions and getting themselves killed. You have infinite time to plan out each move, and you can observe the layouts of each map before sending out a large squad of characters with varied roles to beat it your own way. This last point about building a team of specialised characters and the large-scale strategy that emerges from it is an element that every prior Fire Emblem spin-off game has retained to an extent, yet it's hard to emphasise in a fighting game where you may have to contend with an opponent looping 4-way mix-ups on you into the vortex. The best way I can convey any sense of team building is to make this game a tag team fighter, where each player selects 2 different characters and can call upon the other character for assists or swap between them. That way we can allow more flexibility in how one approaches a fight, and incorporate some of the more support-oriented functions like healing, dancing, rallying, or rescue dropping into certain characters' movesets. Plus, Fire Emblem has had various mechanics centered around characters fighting alongside each other, so it fits. In terms of general game feel, a key element of Fire Emblem is positioning your units to minimize unnecessary unsafe damage, so Fire Emblem warriors? Heroes? Brides? Should emphasize careful positioning and neutral by giving everyone large hitboxes, which is kind of a given when most of the cast wields bladed weapons, and somewhat limited movement. Specifically, I'd make this a traditional 2D fighter, because as much as a 3D fighter like Soul Calibur or a hybrid like Pokken Tournament looks like it could make a fine blueprint, I have no personal experience with either series. The vast majority of my fighting game knowledge comes from 2D fighters and platform fighters, but we already have lots of Fire Emblem content in Smash, so making the dedicated Fire Emblem game another platform fighter would be a waste. The way I envision it, everyone would have a basic walk, run, backdash and jump, but nothing too wild like a double jump or air dash. There'd be maybe 2 basic attack buttons you could press together to throw, in addition to a button for assists and a button for special moves. Yes, this game would have single button specials, because we do have to appeal to a large audience of newcomers who've never played a fighting game before, or at least have only played Smash, a fighting game known for having single button specials. Avoiding attacks is a key mechanic in Fire Emblem, so we'd have to include an invincible spot dodge. Meanwhile, meter management is a key mechanic of fighting games, so we'd have to include a super meter, which I guess we could call EXP or SB or something, and give each character super moves they can spend half of that meter to perform. You can swap between your 2 characters normally, or you can spend a quarter of that meter to dual strike, cancel your lead character's attack with one from your incoming assist, dual guard, cancel your lead's block stun with an armored approach from your assist, or spend half of that meter to dual super, cancel your lead's super move into one from your assist. If all that sounds like it could lead to some oppressive game states where a team could land one hit and wail on the opponent for the entire match, we might need to incorporate a burst. The best Fire Emblem theme I could come up with for this is the skill Miracle, but I'm only suggesting this as a gameplay function if we need it. Now for a Fire Emblem mechanic we will not be implementing, the weapon triangle. I don't know about you, but characters getting flat buffs or nerfs in specific matchups that players can't do anything about does not sound to me like a deep or engaging fighting game mechanic. Plus, how would that work against characters who wield multiple weapon types? Would we have to limit each character to using only one weapon type? Would it make everyone's movesets much more boring? Now with that context out of the way, we can move on to the question everybody wants to ask. Why would the Fire Emblem characters be fighting each other? Unfortunately, a crossover like this is expected to have some story to explain why all these characters from distinct worlds are together in one place and can beat each other up. Problem is, most of the Fire Emblem characters are friendly and on the same side of good. If they were to meet each other and they weren't contractually obligated to serve a master of any kind, the first thing they would do is form one giant alliance. Admittedly, most crossover spin-offs don't worry too much about their stories and are mainly excuses to bring people's favourite characters together, so I feel better about taking the easy way out here. Most of the existing Fire Emblem crossovers have created their own settings with brand new characters to act as a framing device for the rest of the story, but once these games are over and done with, their original universes tend to get left behind and forgotten about. Therefore, to avoid creating yet another forgettable original universe to join the pile, I would make Fire Emblem Onmyoji shamelessly reuse the setting and characters of Fire Emblem Heroes. With this, we already have a reason why the Fire Emblem characters are all together. They were summoned into the Order of Heroes and bound by a contract. If we want them to fight in the story, we can invent a new villain of the week who also has the power to summon heroes to their own side, like each new story arc of Heroes already does. If we want to justify player versus player modes, we can use any of Heroes' player versus player modes, like Summoners Duels or Ether Raids. As you can see, I didn't put much effort into a detailed story, but this did get me thinking about single player content. Obviously, we'd have the fighting game necessities of training mode versus CPU matches and an arcade ladder with what little story this game has sprinkled throughout. Perhaps if you beat arcade mode with a specific character, you would unlock an alternate costume for that character based on their promoted design. I want more than that though. I want an expansive single player mode that incorporates more Fire Emblem features we won't be able to translate into the core gameplay. I'm going to get ahead of myself and warn you in advance that most of your favourite Fire Emblem characters will not make it onto the playable roster. There are simply too many characters from this series' vast history to implement even a tenth of them into a brand new fighting game. What doesn't help is that a lot of those characters have very similar functions due to them sharing a class or story role, so they don't have much unique to themselves that could fill out a full moveset or distinguish them from other characters. At the same time though, I have to include them somewhere in the game. The expansive casts are an integral part of every Fire Emblem game, and it'd do the entire franchise an injustice if I were to completely discard them. Knowing this, I propose that in our single player campaign mode, we allow players to recruit some of these minor characters who couldn't make it onto the playable roster and call them out during battle to perform a set attack similar to an assist. Before entering a battle, you'll be able to deploy up to 4 of them, perhaps instead of a regular assist character so matches don't have too many characters on screen at once. Winning battles could reward you with skills to augment your characters and assist's abilities, and by beating the mode once, you'd unlock a special versus mode where you can use these assists and skills against other players. It might be too expensive to develop all these characters, and it might not add much to the core gameplay, but I do feel it's strongly important to get these characters in one way or another. This is just a suggestion for how we could do that. Another way we could fit minor characters in is through a common feature in many fighting games already: stage cameos. If a stage is based on a specific chapter from a specific game, show characters from that game duking it out in the background or cheering on the main fight between the players. In case players find some of these too distracting or laggy, we should let them disable them so the background is static and they can beat each other up in peace. Naturally, this begs the question, which stages should we include? Maps in Fire Emblem have varied layouts with terrain features for the player to exploit, but 2D fighting game conventions do away with stage hazards since they get in the way of a fight, so we'll have to pick stages purely based on their locations. Since I don't fancy mixing cameo characters from different games onto different stages, I will focus on adding at least one stage from most of the mainline games. From this point on, this video may contain minor spoilers for most Fire Emblem games. I'll try not to give too much away, but if you're very spoiler averse, I recommend clicking off the video and returning once you've played the games you want spoiler free. From Shadow Dragon and Mystery of the Emblem, I'd set a stage outside the Dragon's Table. It's the most scenic location from those games I could think of, and it is significant to their stories. For similar reasons, I choose the Dragon's Gate from the Blazing Blade, and possibly the city of Belhala from Genealogy of the Holy War, although that risks being too spoilery. From Gaiden, I choose that boat Celica sails on in Act 2. There are a few boat stages in fighting games and a lot of boat maps in Fire Emblem, so it felt natural to fit at least one boat stage in here. Along those lines, for a desert map I choose the city of Arcadia from the Binding Blade, and for a bridge stage I choose the Riven Bridge, or the Oribes Bridge, or the Great Bridge from Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn. From Awakening, I don't have much of a choice other than Arena Pharaoh. It's a literal fighting arena where one of the most iconic scenes from that game takes place, and it's already been featured as both a paralog in Engage and a stage in Smash Bros. Likewise, from Fates, I choose the Opera House. It's where one of that game's most iconic scenes takes place. From Three Houses and Engage, I again feel I have to go with their respective hub worlds, Garreg Monastery and the Somniel. I can't decide on anywhere specific in those locations, but anywhere that gives players a good look at the environments. From the Sacred Stones, I choose the Lagdo Ruins, and from 3776, I'd go with the jail in Munster, because why not? Then, because we are using the hero setting for this game, I suppose we should include a stage from that game, such as an Aether Resort. I must confess, I didn't put much thought into building the stage list. To me, Fire Emblem locations aren't as memorable as their characters, especially when you strip them of their gameplay functionality, so this list was an afterthought I scrambled together just because this game needs to have stages. On the bright side, we can finally move on to the part of the fighting game concept people actually care for. That's right, it's time to build the roster. Oh hey, that's the name of another video series by YouTuber Thorgy's Arcade that I've completely ripped off for this video. If you end up liking this video, or you like fighting games or roster building, be sure to give his channel a watch. His content was a major inspiration for this video, so I reckon you'll enjoy it. The first step of building a roster is deciding how many characters to include. This'll be fun. As I alluded to before, there are way too many Fire Emblem characters to include them all in our fighting game. There are 14 distinct mainline Fire Emblem games, each with an average playable roster size of around 50, whereas most fighting games start out with roster sizes in the teens. You could pull from only one game and still struggle to create a satisfying roster. And we should really be trying to represent all of the games lest we want another Fire Emblem Warriors fiasco. Knowing the true scale of the obstacle they are faced with, some would rather search for an opening through which to circumvent it. For this task, they may turn to the dark arts, too foolish to realize that they would bring calamity to all. Quotas. A lot of fan rosters I've seen online like to impose quotas, such as 3 characters from each game, or 1 hero and 1 villain from each game, for the sake of equal representation of the entire series. However, I don't think this approach is fair to every game, because it ignores the context of each game's roster. For example, Three Houses has 4 obvious candidates for playable characters, whereas the Binding Blade only has 1. And I don't think it'd be appropriate for one of those Three Houses characters to be barred from entry just so the Binding Blade can get 2 more characters that significantly fewer people want in the game. Alternatively, a lot of fan rosters suggest tying movesets to classes rather than characters, and rigging multiple characters from across the franchise onto each class moveset. After experimenting with this myself, I find it to be a very quantity over quality approach to character design. Sure, you have a load of characters who wouldn't have made it in otherwise, but comparing the subtle differences between 2 characters of a similar class or 2 variants of the same class across games, it might not make sense for them to share the exact same moveset and animations. Any unique traits or abilities a character may have to be discarded just so their moveset can fit a completely separate character. At that point, I'd rather scrap the clone character and focus on making the original character as unique as they deserve to be. So, with me rejecting game limits, per game quotas, and class-based movesets, we appear to have no choice but to tackle this roster the old-fashioned way. We'll have to evaluate each character on their own merits and pick out the best 16 of them because, as I said earlier, fighting game starting rosters tend to hover in the teens due to limited development resources. If you think this would lead to a roster full of main protagonists, you'd be right, but between their primary weapon types, their techniques for wielding them, and any secondary weapon types they may have, I'm confident we can still make a distinct roster out of them. Here is your starting roster for Fire Emblem Masters of Arms. Hey, I like the sound of that name. Marth. He is pretty much the face of the franchise, the lord from which all other lords derive, so he kind of has to be our Shoto, the all-rounder introductory character for new players. His normal attacks would be elegant sword strikes with range and speed, his gap closer could be some sort of somersault, his reversal would be Dolphin Slash from Smash Bros, and for his projectile, Fulgen shoots sword beams now. Pretend it's the Master Sword from The Legend of Zelda or something, we'll have to take some creative liberties with these characters. Roy. In terms of personality and abilities, he's quite similar to Marth, so we could make him another take on a Shoto, though not exactly a clone of Marth. Whereas Marth would be better at zoning the opponent out, Roy would be better at rushing them down, with his normal attacks having shorter range but faster frame data. His projectile would be a fireball from the Binding Blade, which you'd be able to charge by holding the button down to give it additional hits, making it more effective at locking the opponent down when it hits. His reversal would be Blazer from Smash Bros again, and his gap closer could be a rushing thrust resembling his regular attack from his original game. Ike. After his original games, Ike has typically been characterized as a slow, heavy brute, so let's lean into that once again. He'd be slower than the average fighter, but his attacks would deal more damage. His neutral special would be the Blade Beam from Ragnell, and his down special would be a fiery ground stab loosely based on Eruption from Smash Bros. His first super would be Ether, which would restore some health on hit, but I'm thinking that to expand upon this theme of health management, we make his second super Resolve, a limited time buff to his attack that gets stronger the lower Ike's health is when he activates the super. It wouldn't be a modern fighting game without a rage-inducing combat mechanic. Lyn. Sometimes a fighting game can do with some basic archetypal characters, and Lyn fits to a T the Pixie Rushdown archetype. That character who breaks their wrists, mixing up the opponent, trying to find an opening, only to get hit once and blow up. She'd be the fastest character in the game, both in move speed and attack speed, but she'd have some of the lowest health. Her specials would emphasize this speed, with some teleports to mix the opponent up, quick stabs to add extra hits to combos, and somersaults followed by shots from her bow. Her first super would be her Blade Lord critical hit animation, while her second super would be Astra Storm from Engage, which would rain down a series of arrows in front of Lyn to lock the opponent down. Hector. Big armoured guy, willing to throw down, high attack and defense and lackluster speed, he is our grappler. He'd have slow movement but high damage, a command dash with super armor, a command throw, all typical grappler traits, but to work some of his unique attributes in, his back special would summon a lightning strike from Armads that'd hit roughly 3/4 of a screen away and knock opponents down, to potentially disturb zoners and let him approach. Also, we'd have to work in the Hectorcopter somewhere. I'm thinking as an anti-air or as a brief aerial hover before a downwards dive. Ephraim. He wields a lance, a weapon with a longer reach than a sword, so you'd think that'd make him more of a zoner, but with his tendency to rush into battle, I think he'd be more appropriate as a rushdown. His moveset would be basic, with a few charging stabs forward, up and down for his specials and assists. Perhaps for his neutral special, he'd spin his lance around and you could hold the button to keep spinning and hitting the opponent, then release it for a powerful stab. One of his supers would be Solar Brace, which would restore some health on hit. Micaiah. As a wielder of primarily light magic, she would be a hard zoner with some of the lowest health and worst defensive options in the game. She'd have a basic horizontal projectile in Light, a bigger slower one in L Light. Purge is an attack that hits from the opposite side of the screen and pulls the opponent in for combos, especially when used as an assist. For another one of her assists, she wouldn't attack. Instead, she'd sacrifice some of her health to heal the active character. Thani would probably be a big dumb damage super, but her second super could be based on her mastery skill Corona, and to be extra evil, could temporarily reduce the opponent's movement speed on hit, making it even easier for her to keep you out. Chrom. He'd primarily be another balanced, straightforward sword fighter. His back special could be a jump into an overhead downward stab based on the box art of Awakening, and his forward special could be a sword spin based on the CG fight in Chapter 4 of that game. For some variety, his neutral special would pull out a lance and enter a stance, from which he can perform one of several follow-ups, ranging from a flurry of quick stabs to a rising slash as an anti-air to just cancelling the stance. His first super would be Ether, which, like Ike's version, would heal Chrom on hit. And again, to play with his health, his second super could be Vengeance, a single attack that would get stronger the less health Chrom has. Robin. As a tactician who wields both a sword and magic, I felt it appropriate to center their playstyle around set play. Knocking the opponent down, attacking them on wake up, making them guess which direction to block in, and if successful, repeating until they're dead. To accomplish this, they'd use basic sword attacks for their normals and a variety of magic spells for their specials, such as Bolganon, which would set up in front of Robin and activate after roughly 1 second has passed, and Thunder, which would set up half a screen away and activate after a similar time span. To counter this, any spells would deactivate if Robin is hit, and they wouldn't have great move speed or health. Their first super would be a full-screen laser in Thoron, and I'm thinking their second super could be Gale Force, which would simply cancel whatever they're doing and return them to a neutral state, allowing them a potential second chance at a mix-up. Also, to clarify before you ask me, all avatars would have both their male and female variants selectable, with no gameplay differences between the two, just different appearances and voice lines. Olm. Given his headstrong attitude and rough sword fighting style, I think Olm would fit as another rushdown. To make him stand out, I give him a unique trait based on his double lion combat art that allows him to cancel one special move into another at the cost of some of his health. Said specials can include Penetrate, a running slash that can switch sides, Duelist Sword, a stab followed by backstab, and Hunter's Volley to throw a bow move in there. His first super would be Sense Scale, and his second would be Lunar Flash. Celica. Like Robin, she dual wields a sword and magic, so we'd again have her use her sword for her normals and magic for her specials. She could have Seraphim as a basic horizontal projectile and Excalibur as an upward arcing projectile to hit aerial opponents. However, each of her special moves would drain some of her health on use, referencing magic costing HP to casting Gaiden, while select heavier normals would restore some of her health on hit. This makes her play a game of hit and run in which she must manage her own health every time she uses a projectile, with the aim of finding openings to earn that lost health back. One of her supers would be Ragnarok Omega, and maybe if you put Celica and Olm on a team together, their dual supers could gain special animations? Sigurd. Here we have our first character to fight on horseback, and that requires me to establish how horses would work in this game. Not that much different from foot soldiers. They'd have all the same basic movement options, they'd just have unusual hitboxes and hurtboxes that might make it harder to hit certain attacks but easier to get hit. Onto Sigurd specifically, his sword Turfing usually grants a resistance boost when equipped, which I translate into a special that briefly spawns a barrier that absorbs projectiles. However, he's known for charging headfirst into combat, so most of his moveset would incentivize him getting closer to the opponent. His forward special and assist could be a charging slash that could switch sides with the opponent, but when used as an assist, any non-mounted character could press the button again when next to Sigurd to jump onto his horse, ride it for the duration of the move, and jump off next to the opponent, giving slower characters another approach option and Sigurd some valuable utility besides attacking. Leaf. In his base form, Leaf would be another sword-wielding foot soldier. He could have an arcing projectile based on the Lightbrand's ranged attack, but for his other moves, he could flat out copy the other sword fighters for all I care. The only move that matters is his super, which would cost all of his meter as opposed to the usual half, but would promote him into a Master Knight, completely changing his moveset to give him a horse and the entire convoy of weapons. He could have a charging strike with the Killer Axe, a 2-hit jumping slash with the Master Lance, the Tornado spell as a slow projectile wall. He'd basically be the most overpowered character in the game, but you'd need to unlock him mid-match. Corrin. Now we have our first character who can transform into a dragon, so I need to establish how transformations work. Corrin would start each round in human form, in which they'd fight using their sword and by augmenting some of their body parts into those of a dragon. In this form they'd be weak but agile, and each attack they land would fill their unique dragon gauge. By using their back special, they'd transform into dragon form, in which they'd be much slower but stronger, and their moves would have longer range and some super armor. In this form, the Dragon Gauge would gradually deplete, and if it reached 0, they'd forcibly transform back into human form with a lengthy vulnerable animation, so the player would be encouraged to find time to manually transform back before that happens. For specific moves, their neutral special in human form could be a small projectile based on Dragon Fang shot from Smash Bros, whereas in Dragon form it could be a much larger projectile that drains even more of the Dragon Gauge when used. In human form, one of their supers could be Torrential Roar as it appears in Engage, a horizontal full-screen laser, whereas in Dragon form the same super could be Torrential Roar as it appears in Smash Bros, a vertical multi-hitting whirlwind. Byleth. Their Sword of the Creator has the special ability to extend like a whip, so they lend themselves well to being another zoner with long-ranged normals. One or two of their specials could involve them extending the sword to its maximum range to try and grab the opponent. If it does, then based on the button pressed afterwards, Byleth could either let the opponent go, pull the opponent towards them, or pull themselves towards the opponent. Adding another layer to their mobility, their back special could use the power of Divine Pulse to teleport themselves to where they were 2 seconds ago, rewarding careful planning in advance with opportunities to retreat or mix up the opponent. Ruptured Heaven would be a big dumb damage super. Aleeha. Engage's main selling point was the emblems, ghosts of former Fire Emblem protagonists who can fight alongside their wielders and grant them new abilities. They're reminiscent of Personas from, well, Persona, and Persona had a good fighting game, so let's blatantly copy the mechanics from that game. Aleeha's normals would use their own sword and some fist fighting techniques, but several of their specials would summon Emblem Marth to perform attacks independently from Aleeha. If Marth is hit while he's out, he disappears, and if he's hit a total of 3 times, he gets broken and unable to be summoned for several seconds. One of Aleeha's supers would have them engage with Marth, a temporary power-up in which Marth is removed from play, Aleeha's moves gain additional hits, they can perform Marth specials by themselves, and they can press the super input again to unleash Lodestar Rush and end the engage state early. That makes 16 unique fighters, but I can squeeze some extra fan service in here in the form of clone characters. I know I expressed distaste earlier at the concept of building movesets to fit multiple characters each, but that doesn't mean I'm against clones as a concept. In moderation, in cases where they make sense, they can be excellent ways to bump up the roster for cheap. I'm not counting these towards the total roster number, so for all intents and purposes, we're still at 16 characters. First and most obviously, Lucina as a clone of Chrom. She is his daughter, and she learned how to fight from him. In Warriors and Engage though, she's shown wielding bows while Chrom isn't, so perhaps we'd swap out 1 or 2 of her specials with bow moves. Seliph as a clone of Sigurd. He is his son, and when promoted as a Night Lord, they share the same battle animations. However, in the story, he is more reluctant to fight than his father, so I think he'd have stronger options at range, but not be as powerful up close. Eliwood over Roy. He is his father, and although their combat animations in their original games aren't identical, I think they're close enough that they could work with the same moveset. Notably, this means Durandal would have to gain the ability to shoot fire like the Binding Blade, but that's on Intelligent Systems for naming this thing the Blazing Blade in the first place. Finally, Eirika over Marth. This is my biggest stretch, since not only do they not have a lore reason to share fighting styles, they aren't even from the same universe. However, to leave Eirika off after including almost every other protagonist would feel unfair, and out of all the movesets we've already made, I think she fits Marth's the most. I give her a different super in Lunar Brace, while Marth would have Lodestar Rush, and like Olm and Celica, her and Ephraim could have special dual supers. That is your starting roster for Fire Emblem Masters of Arms, and yikes, it's not looking good at the moment. Out of 16 characters, 13 of them wield swords as their primary weapon, and all of them are main protagonists. Putting aside the differences in their playstyles, most Fire Emblem fans are going to be turned off by that and not give the game a fair chance. Thankfully, because this is a modern fighting game, it's bound to have character DLC. For now, I envision one season containing 6 characters. If you think 6 characters is a bit generous for one season, consider it compensation for the fact that our first 3 characters are incredibly obvious and predictable. Edelgard, Dimitri, and Claude. These 3 are easily the biggest names in Fire Emblem I left off the base roster, because I couldn't comfortably fit them on without sacrificing some entire game's representation. But by tactically delaying them to paid DLC, we could guarantee Season Pass sales right out of the gate, and hopefully, maybe, after all is said and done, make back the development costs of this game. As for how they play, Edelgard would be a slow powerhouse focused on finding one punish opportunity and dealing humongous damage. Landing her normal attacks would fill her unique Raging Storm gauge, which she could spend to cancel her special moves into each other. Dimitri would be a comparatively simple rushdown character with no elaborate gimmicks up his sleeve. Atrocity would be a big dumb damage super. Claude would be a tricky zoner, with plenty of arrow shots, at least one somersault special, and perhaps a trap of some kind he could set up. His neutral special would be another arrow shot, but if it hits, it'd give Claude a fallen star stock, and then if he uses his flip special, it would spend a stock to gain parry frames on startup. If the opponent attacks those parry frames, they'd get stuck as Claude fires a powerful homing arrow at them. Chris. They were the series' first proper Avatar character, so they have some significance to its history, and because of this, you could choose their starting class. Therefore, in this game, they could wield a large variety of weapons, and I propose we accomplish this by making them the RNG fighter. Their normals would use a sword like they're seen with in promotional material, but their neutral special would pull out a random item referencing another class that they could use by pressing neutral special again, such as a fighter's axe that can be swung overhead, or an archer's bow that can shoot projectiles, or a knight's shield that can parry attacks if timed correctly. Each item would have a set number of uses of that move before the item breaks and Chris must pull out a new one. If you don't like an item, you can throw it with forward special to discard it, or you can store it with back special to take it back out later. Anna. She is somewhat of a mascot for the Fire Emblem franchise, having incarnations in almost every game. We could be fancy and incorporate everyone as an alternate costume, but I'd rather keep things simple. Because we're setting this game in the Heroes world, it makes the most sense to go with Heroes Anna. It helps that this Anna's primary weapon is an axe, a weapon type this roster is sorely lacking at the moment. Though I might throw in a couple of specials where she pulls out a Levin sword and Shining Bow to reference her incarnations from Awakening and Fates respectively. For her first super, she toss an almighty spear referencing her appearance in Awakening's Apotheosis DLC. And for her second super, she'd call for an ally, and out would come either Alphonse to perform a series of sword strikes, Sharena to charge ahead with her shield, or Veronica to pull the opponent in with dark magic. Which of the 3 you'd get would be random. Because Fire Emblem Heroes is a gacha game. For our last character, I'd take a trip to the spin-offs and choose Tsubasa from Tokyo Mirage Sessions. A key mechanic in that game is Sessions, in which once you've hit an enemy's weakness, your other party members will jump in and combo them. So we'd adapt her session attacks into her assists, and some of her physical skills and wind magic into her special moves. Her first super would be Aerial Dance, her default super move in her original game, and her second could be Falling Star, mainly for the sake of a cameo from Itsuki. Yes, I did essentially do what I hate and add a side character over the main character, but from what I've seen of Tokyo Mirage Sessions online, players tend to find Itsuki boring and overwhelmingly prefers Tsubasa, who has so much story content she might as well be the main character over Itsuki. In this instance, I feel justified. That is your roster after one season of DLC, and it's looking a bit better. We've filled some gaps in representation, we've got more weapon variety, and we've managed to put some non-protagonists in there. In fact, if you look at this roster, almost all the main protagonists are already here. For future characters, we're free to pick from the franchise's vast lineup of side characters or antagonists without them having to compete for their spot with their game's main protagonist. I propose we capitalise on this. We don't make a second season of DLC. Instead, we make a full-blown sequel, with new characters, stages, mechanics, and single-player content wrapped up as a new game a few years later that anyone who skipped the first game because they didn't like the roster can jump right into. All 22 characters from the first game are returning, and I'd like to bump that roster number up to a neatly divisible 30, giving us 8 new character slots to fill. One of which is reserved. Remember when I said the original game would launch alongside the next Nintendo console and then the sequel would launch a few years later? In that time gap, it's entirely likely that the next mainline Fire Emblem will have been released, or at least be on the horizon. If so, then it makes no sense for us not to add that game's protagonist to our crossover. I will not attempt to create a moveset for a character who doesn't exist in the public consciousness yet. I only hope they're a bit more unique than just another sword fighter. Alright, on to the characters we can make movesets for. Cedar. One of the big additions to this sequel would be the introduction of flying characters, so I need to establish how they'd work. The way I envision it, they'd have the same ground movement options as any foot or horseback fighter, but their jumps would be higher and floatier, and they could initiate a glide by dashing forward in the air. Cedar especially would have a very agile air-based moveset with plenty of specials that alter her aerial momentum and make her tricky to snipe out. Similarly to Sigurd, if a non-mounted character was in the air and called one of her assists, they'd be able to ride her Pegasus during the assist for some extra aerial mobility. To counter this, every character, or at least the non-mounted ones, would gain a super jump as another option to reach them in the air, and we may have to go back and give some of the old characters better anti-airs. Speaking of flyers, Camilla. Come on, you know intelligent systems wouldn't resist an opportunity to put Camilla in here. Jokes aside, she'd be another flyer, sort of the heavy counterpart to Cedar. She wouldn't dash all around the screen like Cedar would, instead she'd be able to deal and take more damage outright. Plus, since she can use magic, she'd have a few projectile attacks for some added range. Tiki. Specifically adult Tiki, because I think she's cooler and her story interactions would be more interesting if she remembered the Awakening cast. She is another shapeshifter, so we could copy Corrin's transformation mechanics onto her, but Corrin is somewhat of an anomaly among shapeshifters in that they're shown to be a competent fighter in human form. Tiki isn't, so her human form would be a bit weak on purpose, with most of her normals being lazy pushes and kicks, and maybe some specials spreading fire or ice breath on the ground. When she enters dragon form though, she'd be at her full power with heavy claw and tail attacks, a fog breath that can be held to extend its duration, a giant projectile, and a glide similar to Cedar and Camilla. Azura. She has powers that do whatever the plot of Fates wants them to do, but usually they involve manipulating water. So in addition to her basic lance moves, she'd have plenty of specials in which she could summon waves as basic projectiles or to push the opponent around, or even as an assist to push the active character towards the opponent. In addition, because she's the type of unit that refreshes other units' turns, another one of her assists would sing to her ally to grant them a buff. Let's say the next attack they hit becomes a counter hit, allowing for longer combos, unless they get hit and the buff disappears. The Black Knight. There's a particular type of character my roster is currently lacking. Villains. I believe I have good reasons for doing this. I was prioritizing the main heroes first, and even once I'd gone through most of them, I still judged each individual character on their own merits, and avoided adding a character I thought wouldn't add much to the game just because they're a villain. The Black Knight sure has merits though. He's one of the most popular villains in the franchise, and one of the most popular characters from Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn. He has a giant suit of armor, so he'd be able to take lots of attacks and have super armor on several of his moves. Give him an assist where he appears in front of you and just stands there, armoring the opponent's attacks and forcing them to throw or jump over him. His sword Alondite is a counterpart to Ike's sword Ragnell, so he could have the same blade beam projectile as Ike. He has Warp Powder for a teleport special, and Eclipse could be a big dumb damage super. On a last note, if Nintendo and Intelligent Systems weren't concerned about spoilers, his alter ego could be an alternate costume. Veil. Another Engage character pretty much means another emblem wielder, but while Alear is more of a rushdown, Veil would be more of a zoner. She'd use her dagger and tome in equal measure. Maybe for one special she'd create an explosion with Obscurite, and for another she'd throw the Misery Cord, and if the opponent is hit by it, they'd take poison damage over time. As for which emblem she'd wield, I'd give her Corrin, so that when they engage, her specials could leave behind area of effect dragon veins the opponent would have to avoid. Similarly to the Black Knight, if spoilers weren't a concern, her alter ego could be a costume too. Lastly, Shez. With the Fire Emblem Warriors games being real-time action games, it's only fair that I add one of their characters to our fighting game. And I chose Shez from Three Hopes over Rowan and Liana from the original because people actually like Shez. That and they have a more unique moveset involving two swords and some magic. The benefit of being from an action game is that most of their moveset has already been created and animated, we just have to pick and choose the moves we like. I'd give them their Flugel class action as their neutral special, their strong 4 attack as their forward special, their strong 5 as their back special, and their warrior special as one of their supers. We could fit in their Shadow Flash teleport and awakened state somewhere, I'm just not exactly sure where and how. That is your starting roster for Fire Emblem Masters of Arms 2, and it's shaping up to be something great, with a wider range of characters and playstyles that comes closer to showcasing the variety in Fire Emblem's cast of characters. If I have to critique my own work though, I feel I've been a bit biased towards the modern games. Most of the characters I added in the DLC and sequel come from games released from 2010 onwards, while several of the older games have only 1 or 2 characters. I have established that equal representation isn't necessarily fair and I pick characters on their own merits, but I also recognise the importance of satisfying fans of older or less popular entries, and I can try to do both at the same time. That will be a focus of this game's DLC. Yes, after 30 characters, I can keep going with roster picks. That's how fun roster building can be. To be consistent with the first game, I'd envision one season of 6 characters. Leon. Like the Black Knight, he's another fan favourite villain who could bring a lot to the table gameplay-wise. He wields Dark Magic, a weapon type this roster is mostly lacking, so he'd be a slow but powerful zoner. To complement this, he is a necromancer and could possibly summon monsters or phantoms that attack independently of him for his specials. Lastly, he is controlled by a giant demon king, giving him 2 easy supers in Demon Light and Ravager. Berkut. Another fan favourite villain, he kind of becomes obsessed with power towards the end of Echoes, so I'd give him a unique power gauge he'd build by landing his normal attacks and parrying projectiles with his Phantasm special. This gauge would be split into around 4 levels, and at higher levels his attacks would gain extra damage and sometimes range, but it'd gradually deplete over time, and using special moves besides his aforementioned Phantasm would deplete it further. Said specials would call upon a certain fiery entity I wouldn't show too much of to hide spoilers, and could include an erupting pyre that'd get taller at higher power, an armoured command dash that could armour more hits at higher power, and Entrap, a projectile command throw that'd teleport the opponent in front of Berkut on hit and would travel further at higher power. Lewin. As a user of wind magic who's known for running away from his responsibilities, he'd be one of the most mobile characters on the roster. Straight up, make his forward special an air dash and his down special a double jump he can drift left and right during. Give him a controllable wind projectile, an arc wind pillar appearing from the ground in front of him, and an explosion from Falsetti for one of his supers, and you've got a very obnoxious hit and run character who can also mix you up. For some supportive utility, one of his assists would blow allies and opponents away towards the corner for a second or two. If it wouldn't add too much to the DLC's budget, Lewin could even come with a clone in the form of Zed. Because he starts as a sage who can use staves, he could have a different down special in which he teleports using a rewarp staff, but otherwise he's just extra fan service where it fits. Cecilia. As another mage, she'd have a few projectiles like L-Fire, Air Caliber, Bolting, and 4-Blaze for a big dumb damage super, but I am starting to feel like I've added a lot of mages recently and exhausted most of the unique ways to use magic, so it's a good thing Cecilia's both on a horse and proficient in staves. One of her specials could pull out a Berserk staff and inflict the opponent with a debuff that allows them to damage their own assists, making them more scared to call them out. In addition, one of her assists could warp a nearby ally set distance across the screen, while another could rescue a faraway ally next to her, giving her some extremely valuable, potentially overpowered movement utility. Gullveig. Despite setting this game in the Heroes world, I've neglected even the Heroes cast in my roster, so I set out to add one more character from that game, and I decided on Gullveig, who I am aware is a controversial character, and her Choose Your Legends win was especially contentious. But if you look back, Intelligent Systems may have a pattern of deciding character inclusions based on Choose Your Legends wins. Lyn in Warriors, Gatekeeper in Three Hopes, Camilla in Engage. If true, then it's likely that out of Heroes' cast, they would look towards Gullveig. Besides, that's only the secondary reason I'm including her. The primary reason is that she has 8 snakes and can manipulate time. Imagine a projectile she could fire and then rewind its movement, or a command grab where if she landed it, the opponent's movements over the last 2 seconds would play out in reverse. There is incredible moveset potential here that I don't think any other Fire Emblem character could remotely replicate. For our very final character, brace yourself for one of the deepest cuts I could possibly make. Neve from Cypher. For those who aren't familiar with the lore behind this trading card game's original characters, I don't blame you. Neve is a researcher from a world overflowing with boundless chaos, a sort of substance that travels the boundaries between worlds and consumes them. Its true nature was never properly elaborated on before Cypher's discontinuation, but if revisited, it could add context to games like the Blazing Blade, Engage, and all the past Fire Emblem Worlds Collide crossovers. I feel at some point in one of these crossovers, the topic of boundless chaos needs to pop up again, and including Neve in our fighting game would tie into that neatly. As for how she'd fight, she mainly uses a mixture of swords, magic, and whatever these overly long skill names are. So befitting her role as a researcher, she should have some elaborate big brain gimmick to rival Asuka Arkreutz from Guilty Gear. This is our final character, go wild! That is your final 36 character roster for Fire Emblem Masters of Arms 2, built up over 2 games and 2 seasons of DLC. And at last, it's at a point in which I can honestly say, within the constraints of the Fire Emblem IP and the fighting game genre, I'm satisfied with this. We've managed to include the key characters from almost all the games using almost all the key weapon types, with distinct playstyles and some gimmicks thrown in. So, to answer the question presented in the title, would a Fire Emblem fighting game work? In my opinion, it could. But it'd take at least 2 games to get there, and there's a high risk the first game would flop and the second game wouldn't get greenlit as a result. I blame the general structure of the Fire Emblem games for that, how every game has a rotating cast but the characters still fill similar functions. As someone working with someone else's IP, there's nothing I can really do about it. Would I prefer it if that structure was different to begin with? No, it's a core part of the Fire Emblem series' identity. A major reason it's garnered so many fans and inspired so many new works over the decades. Fire Emblem wouldn't be Fire Emblem without the loosely homogeneous casts. For the purposes of the main line games, that aspect is perfect as is. All it means for me is that Fire Emblem might be harder to make a fighting game out of, but that's the setback I can live with. Now, a Fire Emblem party game, on the other hand, that'd rock. You could have grid-based maps, buyable items, turn-based battles, leveling up, infuriating RNG. You could give characters some unique abilities to add strategy, but not so many that you'd struggle to come up with them, and you could develop them for cheaper, meaning you could put more of them in the base game. See, if you just pick the right combinations, you can get much better ideas to begin with and save yourself all these headaches.